Somewhere on an island in the Nile, there is a stone staircase that drops straight into the water. Nobody prays there anymore. But for 3,000 years, it decided whether you ate that winter. No parliament set your tax rate in ancient Egypt. No finance minister signed off on it. A river did, and a single graduated column of stone read that river's answer 1 cubit at a time. Here's the machine nobody built on purpose that kept an entire civilization from starving or from being taxed into ruin. This isn't really a story about Egypt. It's a story about a problem every large civilization since has had to solve, and most got wrong. How do you tax people fairly in real time, using nothing but imperfect information about a resource you don't control? Egypt's answer was the nilometer, a stone gauge cut with cubit markings, built into a well or a staircase connected to the river. Some sat inside temple courtyards. One of the oldest was carved into the rock near the temple of Satet on Elephantine Island, close to modern Aswan, nearly at the southern edge of Egypt itself, positioned to catch the flood before anyone downstream even knew it was coming. Every year, the Nile flooded. Every year, officials needed to know by how much. Too little water, and the fields wouldn't flood far enough to deposit the silt that made Egyptian farming possible without irrigation canals or fertilizer. Too little water meant famine. Too much, and the flood tore through mud-brick villages, drowned livestock, and washed away the boundary markers that told farmers where their land actually ended. There was a target. Ancient writers described it as roughly 16 cubits, about 8 meters, as the level where the flood was perfect. Enough to soak the land, not enough to destroy it. Anything meaningfully below that number, and the state already knew, months in advance, that the harvest would fail. So the number on the nilometer wasn't just weather data, it was the opening line of the year's entire tax code. Picture the moment. A priest or an official climbs down the stone steps at dawn, watches the water settle against the markings, and reads a number. That single reading would ripple outward through every granary, every scribe's office, every farming household in the region for the next 12 months. Because once the flood level was recorded, scribes converted it directly into a tax rate. Higher flood, higher assessed yield, higher grain tax, lower flood, and rates were adjusted downward, sometimes exempted almost entirely in a true low year, because taxing a famine only produces revolt, not revenue. This is where the story usually skips straight to pharaohs and pyramids. But the people who actually ran this system were never the ones wearing the crown. They were scribes, low-ranking literate men trained for years to master a script most Egyptians couldn't read, sent out from Memphis or Thebes to sit beside the nilometer, log the reading, and carry that number into a tax registry that covered the entire kingdom. Later, under Ptolemaic and then Roman administration, this got formalized further. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing around the turn of the millennium, described officials stationed specifically to track and publish the Nile's rise because the whole tax apparatus depended on that data reaching the right desks in time. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder recorded the same threshold numbers, the flood levels that meant hunger, and the ones that meant plenty, because by his era, the Nile's reading had become an economic indicator as closely watched as any market price. Archaeologists have since found the physical evidence of exactly this bureaucracy in action. A nilometer-linked tax structure excavated near the Nile, complete with the administrative apparatus built specifically to convert a water level into a revenue figure. The stone didn't just measure a river, it fed a filing system. And that system had one flaw baked into its foundation. The entire tax base of a civilization depended on a single reading, at a single point on a single river. What happens when that reading is wrong? What happens when the flood comes early, or a nilometer silts up, or the empire's attention drifts somewhere else for a season? Because it did go wrong. Multiple times across Egyptian history, a string of poor floods produced multi-year famines so severe that ancient sources described them reshaping dynasties. Not because the idea of measuring the flood was flawed, but because the entire fiscal and food system had no real backup when the one instrument it trusted told everyone the truth they didn't want to hear. When the flood failed, granaries emptied, tax revenue collapsed at exactly the moment the state needed money most, to buy grain, to move it, to keep order. The nilometer hadn't caused the famine, it had simply been the first to know. And a government built entirely around trusting one number in one location had no second system to catch it when that number turned catastrophic. This is why the nilometer mattered long after the reasons for building it were forgotten. It explains something larger than one river gauge in one ancient kingdom. It explains why Egypt could support cities of scale that most of the ancient world couldn't sustain for thousands of years off a single unpredictable natural cycle turned into a functioning tax system, and why the fragility of that same system shows up again and again in the famine years, the revolts, the moments when trust in the state cracked exactly when the flood did. The Romans kept using nilometers for centuries after they conquered Egypt, precisely because they understood what they'd inherited, not a curiosity, but the load-bearing instrument of an entire province's economy. You don't live near a nilometer, but you live inside its descendants. Every tax system you've ever paid into runs on some version of this same idea. A single trusted measurement, read by people you'll never meet, quietly converted into what you owe. What's your civilization's nilometer? The number nobody questions running right now, deciding something about your life until the one year it's wrong.